Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, welcome. My name is Kiana and I do a lot of sewing and fashion videos, and today I have a sewing tutorial for you guys. So you guys already saw this beauty in the intro. This beautiful cherry strapless dress with the band going across the top. Love her. My dress has a slit in it. You don't need to do a slit if you don't want to. You can do double slits if you would like. You also saw the corset in the beginning. This is a little 2-for-1 pattern action. To get that shape of the corset, you do not have to alter the pattern at all. I do have the pattern already altered for the corset in your pattern purchase, so you get a little 2-in-1. And if you're interested in seeing the development of the pattern in the prototyping, that was in part 1, so I will link that video on the top of the screen and down below. But in this video, we're just going to be going into the sewing tutorial, and if you would like the pattern for the sewing tutorial, that is the first link down below. And my loyal subscribers know that I always give a discount on the first 2 days that I release a pattern, so you can use the code Strapless to get 30% off your pattern purchase until tomorrow at midnight Eastern time. If you would like to know all the supplies and materials needed for this project, that is also in the first link down below. Also, all the sewing equipment I use throughout this video is listed in the YouTube listing description below. This is a super cute dress. I would rank it as an intermediate sewing level, but all of my beginners, I believe if you take your time and really work for it, I totally think that this could be a beginner-friendly project. But I'm going to rank it as intermediate. You can definitely make it easier by using plain weave cotton fabric like I did. That is the easiest fabric to work with. Pleather fabric, like I'm going to use for the corset, is definitely a way to make this pattern more advanced. So pick and choose. Anyways, without further ado, let's just get into the sewing tutorial. All right, time to print your pattern. So when you're printing, make sure you print out at 100% scale, and then you're gonna line everything up. It's gonna go from left to right, everything prints out in order. And you're gonna just match everything up at the lettered diamonds that intersect each page. Make sure your pages don't overlap, don't trim down your pages, just place them edge to edge so that they're touching, and then you're gonna wanna tape everything together. Personally, I really prefer using cardstock and packing tape so my patterns last for a long time. And then I'm going to cut it out, so make sure you refer to your instruction pamphlet to figure out what size you need to cut and figure out which line you should be cutting on. So for reference, I'm cutting out a US size 0, and make sure you go by the measurements in the chart. Since it's strapless, it's really important that you measure yourself well, especially in the bust, and that you refer to your instruction pamphlet to see if you need a size up or size down depending on the fabric that you're using. Now I'm just going to lay all of my patterns out on my fabric and cut everything out. Be sure that you're paying attention to the instructions on each pattern piece, making sure you're cutting out either on the fold or you're cutting 2 of each or 1 of each. Just really refer to those instructions. I'm choosing to make the most adorable little cherry dress. It's gonna be so cute with a red neckline band. I thought the look of the red bringing out the cherries would be super duper cute. And spoiler alert, it is. Now we're going to work on the bodice. So first, I'm just going to line everything up and keep myself really nice and organized. I like to do this because if I start removing my pattern pieces, it can get very confusing. So I'm just gonna sew all of these vertical seam lines. And be careful when you're sewing in the bust area specifically, just because it is a curve going on to a straight edge, so it can be a little bit challenging. So just go nice and slow. Once you've sewn everything, take it over to your serger and finish it off. You don't have to use a serger if you want. You can use pinking shears, you can use a zigzag stitch, anything to keep it from fraying, and then give everything a nice press. Do not skip the pressing step, especially for this garment. Now we're going to move on to the skirt. So I'm basically going to repeat the same process as I did for the bodice, where I organize everything first, because these pieces especially look very, very similar, but they are not. So if you don't want to slit, you can just sew up all of those vertical seam lines like you did with the bodice, but if you do want to slit, decide which side you want the slit on and finish those edges beforehand. I'm going to finish them with the serger. Again, you can use a zigzag stitch or whatever you like. Then you're going to want to place those pieces together, right sides together at the seam, and sew from the top to where you want your slit to start. You want your slit to be between 5 and 7.5 inches, depending on if you want it to be a small slit opening or a large slit. I'm doing 6.5 inches. Now I'm gonna take it over to my ironing board and press that seam completely open. Even where it's not sewn, I'm gonna press it open 1/2 inch. Again, where it's not sewn, I'm going to fold it under another 1/4 inch and press it again. So it should look like this. Then we're just gonna stitch down the seam allowance around that open edge, pivoting where the slit begins. So we're gonna go up one edge. When we get to the top of the slit, I'm going to keep my needle in the fabric, raise my presser foot, and then pivot my work. Sew across and then pivot again and sew back down that slit. And then your slit is done. Here we go. Then we're just going to sew up all the other vertical seam lines of the skirt. And then after I sew it, I'm going to serge it and then make sure you press those seams. Here's what we have so far. So we have the skirt and the bodice. I'm going to place those right sides together along the waistline seam and make sure you pin it where those vertical seams are. You want to make sure those vertical seam lines match up between the bodice and the skirt so it looks professional. That's kind of how you know it's homemade if those seams don't match up. So spend some time making sure they are matched up. Then I'm just going to sew along that waistline seam. After I sew it, I am of course going to serge it and then finally press it. Now we're going to move on to the neckline band. So when you pull out your neckline band, make sure it's faced the correct way, like you have the top at the top and the bottom at the bottom, because it's not really intuitive. Place both of your neckline band pieces right sides together. We're not going to sew along the top, but we are going to sew along the sides and the bottom. So go ahead and do that. And then I'm just going to serge those edges and then finally clip the corners and then turn it right side out and give it a really good press. Make sure it's nice and crisp. And then I'm just going to put this aside for now and bring back the dress because we are going to put an invisible zipper in the seam. So first off, I'm going to finish the edges where the invisible zipper is going to go. Then I'm going to take my invisible zipper, place it at the edge, and I'm going to baste it down. I don't need to baste it down super close to the zipper teeth just so I can get it on there. Then I'm going to close my zipper and I'm going to mark at the waistline with pins. I'm also going to mark where the zipper stops with pins. Then I'm going to unzip that, flip it over to the other side and baste that down again. Then after I do that, I'm going to zip it up, make sure that the waistline matches up and the skirt matches up where the zipper stops. And once I make sure that that's all good, I'm going to sew it down super close to the zipper teeth using a zipper foot. That's just the little way I like to do an invisible zipper. If you like to do it other ways, go ahead. I just thought I would show you how I do it. Then just zip it up, make sure everything is nice, and then I'm going to flip the dress inside out and finish sewing down that seam with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to go back to the neckline of the dress. So grab the neckline band that we already sewed and place it directly on top of the dress neckline. You don't want it to go all the way to the center back. You want it to go about 1/4 inch away from that center back seam and pin it there. Then grab the facing, and before we attach it to the neckline, you want to serge along the bottom edge to finish it. I forgot to do this on camera, so I had to go back and make this, but you guys should remember to do it. Then grab the facing and place it right sides down onto the neckline, and then pin along the top and the sides. This facing will be the exact length of the actual neckline of the dress, so it's going to go all the way and meet up at that center back seam. So it will go over the zipper and you'll be able to pin it on top of the zipper. Now I'm going to sew everything together, so I'm going to start at the center back seam using 1/4 inch seam allowance, switch to across the neckline using 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then finally sew down the other center back using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I'm just going to serge across the top of the neckline before I give it a really good press. Now we're going to understitch. So I'm going to have the facing on the right, I'm going to have the body of the dress on the left, and the seam allowance underneath pointed towards the facing. Then I'm just going to stitch close to that seam line, stitching through the facing and making sure I'm catching the seam allowance underneath. And this is just going to make sure that that facing doesn't roll out while we're wearing the garment. Now we're gonna hem the dress, so you have 1 inch hem allowance. So I'm just going to fold the dress up 1/2 inch twice to use that whole 1 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to stitch it down. Make sure that you try on the dress before you hem it in case you want to hem a little bit more. And I'm just going to top stitch it down, so I'm going to use a little bit of a longer stitch. Now I'm just going to tack the facing down at every single seam line, every single vertical seam. This is just going to also help the facing from rolling out while you're wearing the garment. See, so now it's nice and secure. It cannot physically roll out of the dress, and I'm going to do that at every seam. I'm also going to tack down the neckline band at the back, so these don't fly away while you're wearing it. Just keeps it nice and secure. And then finally, I'm going to add a hook and eye closure at the top of the zipper. Optional, but I think it adds a nice professional touch and it helps you get on the dress. But after that, you are completely done with the dress. Now moving on to the corset, it's going to be very similar to the dress, but a little bit different because there's a lining and there's boning. And I'm going to make it a little bit more challenging by using faux leather. So make sure you look at your actual pattern pieces and see which pattern pieces you need to cut out for the corset because it is different than the dress. This is also personal preference, but I like my corset tops to have 0 stretch in them because I want it to really cinch me in. So this leather actually has stretch in it, so I just turned it to the crosswise direction and cut it out that way, so all the stretch went vertically and not horizontally. So after I cut out my shell and my lining, I'm going to line everything up so I can stay nice and organized and I know where I'm going to sew. And then I'm just going to sew up all of the vertical seam lines on both the shell and the facing. Easy as pie. I'm not going to serge anything, but I am going to press all of my seams open first before I add my boning. So I'm going to grab my boning and casing and cut it to the size of every single seam, and I'm just going to set that aside, organized, so I don't get confused on which boning goes to which seam. Just stay super organized. That's the key for this. You also want to cut out boning the length of your center back seam. You're not going to need the casing for this, but you are going to need the boning. I'm also going to flatten out my boning with an iron. If it came on a roll, it's probably going to be very curved, so you just want to press it and flatten it out. Make sure you don't iron exactly on the plastic. Make sure you're ironing like through some casing or through some fabric because you don't want to melt the plastic. Next, I'm going to remove the actual boning from the casing, again staying very, very organized. That is the key, you guys. And I'm just going to line up the casing on the back side of the corset right at the seam, and I'm going to sew right at the edges of the casing. I'm going to top stitch this down. Because I'm using a faux leather, I'm going to use more of a heavy duty top stitching fabric, so it looks a little nicer, but totally not necessary if you're using regular fabric. Once you sew all of the casing down, it should look like this. And now we're going to work on the neckline band. So just place the 2 neckline band pieces right sides together. Do not sew along the top, just sew along the sides and the bottom. After we do that, we are going to trim the corners, flip it inside out, and then press it. Because I'm using faux leather, I need to do a top stitch around that edge. Now I'm going to take my shell and the neckline band that I just created and place that neckline band right over top of the shell. Then I'm going to grab my lining and place that right side down on top of everything, and then pin it along the side edges and along the top, and then I'm going to sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance, normal seam allowance, everywhere. Then I'm just going to trim down all of the seam allowance and make sure I trim down all the corners as well. Then I'm going to grab my interfacing and place it at both sides of the corset at the center back. I'm going to place it on both the shell side and the lining side. I'm going to fuse it using my iron. Make sure you add a press cloth between that gluey interfacing and the iron so you don't ruin your iron. Then I'm just going to flip everything right side out. Now we're going to top stitch and add the channels for the center back boning. So grab your center back boning, put it at the center back, and see how big of a channel you're going to need to make. This boning is about 1/4 of an inch wide, so I'm going to sew about 3/8 of an inch away from the center back seam so I can fit that piece of boning in the channel. I'm going to top stitch along the neckline really close to that seam, so about 1/8 of an inch away from that seam, and make sure you flip up that neckline band out of the way so that you don't accidentally catch this. So just watch what I'm doing. You can see I've created a nice channel for my boning now, and since I have all the channels for my boning, I'm just going to slip everything into their respective boning channel. Now let's talk bias tape for finishing the hem. I recommend buying one. It's a lot easier than making one, but if you are advanced, go ahead and make some bias tape. I will link a video down below on how to make your own, so feel free to check that out, but I just made some faux leather bias tape. Before we sew the bias tape on though, we need to figure out how wide our bias tape is. Mine is about 1/2 an inch wide, so I'm going to cut my boning down about 1/2 an inch so that I can actually sew through my corset. You are not going to be able to sew through plastic or metal or whatever you're using for your boning, so you want to make sure you do that first. Sew it down. I'm just going to open up the bias tape. I'm going to leave about 1 inch of overhang on the center back. I'm going to gently stretch the bias tape as I sew it, and I'm going to sew in that first crease close to the edge. Then where I left the overhang, I'm going to completely open up the bias tape, fold it underneath, and then stitch along that first crease again, just to make sure you got that whole inch of overhang. Then I'm going to flip the bias tape so it's folded back up completely, and I'm going to stitch in the ditch. Stitching in the ditch means you stitch right in that seam line. Go super slow because it's pretty advanced, and you want to make sure that you're catching the bias tape in the back. That way it stays super secure. But again, go slow. Lastly, we just have to add the lace-up closure. So I'm just going to grab my small eyelets, use whatever size you like, and just figure out how many eyelets you would like to put. I'm going to mark it with some tailor's chalk, mark it however you like, just make sure they are evenly spaced. Then you're just going to insert your eyelets. I have this eyelet tool that I'm obsessed with. I will link it down below. It's amazing. It's changed my life. It makes inserting eyelets so much easier. Most of the time when you buy eyelets, it comes with these little handheld devices that you need to hammer in, but this just makes it so much easier. I cannot recommend it enough. But after you add your eyelets, all you have to do is lace it up with the ribbon or string of your choice. But after that, you are done. All right, you guys, that is how you sew the strapless mini dress and corset. Question of the day for you guys: which project did you like better, the mini dress or the corset I made? I don't really know, honestly, because pleather is my favorite thing to work with, but I'm obsessed with cherries right now and color blocking. She's super cute. Okay, second question of the day: if you're gonna make this pattern, what fabric are you gonna use and how do you envision your design? Just gonna remind you guys, the link for the pattern is the first link down below, and you have until tomorrow at midnight Eastern time to use that code to get 30% off. Make sure you are subscribed with the notification bells turned on if you don't want to miss out on other discounts. And feel free to give me a thumbs up if you liked this video, because it's the easiest way to support your favorite creators for free. Also, feel free to follow me on Instagram and TikTok. My handle is Kiana Bonollo, and if you recreate this look, make sure you post a picture on Instagram and tag me in it, because I love to see what you guys are creating. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I'll see you next time. Bye!